So we'll move to our guest. Today we have Julia Brokaw with us from Xerces Society, and she's going to give us an update on the heavy metal analysis results that were done as part of the Pollinator Pathways grant. So Julia, I'll pass it over to you.
Oh, you're muted, Julia.
Okay, can you all see my screen? Is it showing up?
Yeah, it is.
I'm seeing some nods. Yeah, so this is a project. So I'm a neighbor, but I also work for the Xerces Society. And we're a part of this project called the Pollinator Pathways, which you might have heard about through the St. Pollinators group and the amazing work that they do. And so this is a big collaborative project. There's lots of partners involved. And so the role that I was playing with Xerces was doing some heavy metal sampling in and around pollinator gardens in South Como, Frogtown, and Hamlin Midway. So those are sort of the three neighborhoods that I focused on. And I also did a little bit of pollinator monitoring as well, but I'm just going to focus on the heavy metal sampling results tonight, just kind of share how it went last summer. And then I have another summer of sampling this year. And so I would love for, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to ask you for feedback, ideas, where you want me to sample, what questions you have. And so keep that in mind as I'm sharing. So this is a map of kind of all the three neighborhoods. This is Como Lake here, just to sort of orient you. And so all the little red dots are places where I took soil and leaf samples. I was trying to pick places based on the community feedback that I had last year. I was also trying to pick places that were areas of community concern, and also places that had a pollinator garden intersection and had species that were common across neighborhoods. So I was trying to do a lot of different things in one small funded project. One of the areas that I'll talk about, I just want to flag it, is I did take a number of samples near the Frogtown Foundry, St. Paul Brass and Aluminum Foundry. And so that I'll bring that up later on, but just highlighting that. I tried to focus on a few plant species that are common across neighborhoods. So this included oak trees, cup plant, and goldenrod. And then there was a few others that were sort of one-off samples depending on, the garden or area of interest. For each sample, I took leaves of the plant, and then I took soil directly at the base of the plant of wherever I sampled. So pretty much every plant sample has an associated soil sample underneath that plant. And in some cases, I took a few extra soil samples in a given area. Part of the reason is, insects are interacting with the leaves, thinking a lot about caterpillars and insects that eat leafy materials. And then, of course, you'll find little caterpillars at the base of plants, and different insects interact with the soil quite a bit too. So there's lots of mechanisms that they might interface with heavy metal pollutants. And of course, when we plant gardens, humans are interacting with the soil too. So that's also something that I was thinking about as well. And we don't know that much about how heavy metals really impact pollinators broadly. The research mostly focuses on caterpillars of species that you can rear really easily in labs. So a lot of what I'm going to sort of be comparing against is studies that have looked at butterfly and moth caterpillars. Heavy metals, just like humans, can impact invertebrates in a number of ways. It can directly kill them depending on the concentration, or it can have what we call sublethal effects, which is kind of included in the name, but this is like their ability to orient to their surroundings is compromised, or they don't lay as many eggs as they normally would, or not as many eggs hatch as normally would, or, things like that aren't like directly killing them outright, but causes, changes to behavior or their ability to reproduce. One of the things that people might ask is, oh, what about nectar and pollen? That is extraordinarily difficult to sample. You actually need quite a bit of sample material to sample for heavy metals. Otherwise, that would be fascinating, and I would love to do that. But a lot of what happens with plants is, they uptake heavy metals from the soil into their tissues, and that's kind of how they accumulate, or it deposits on their leaves and on their flowers from the atmosphere. So it's kind of like a both and for how they, yeah, why you might find heavy metals in these different samples. This is a Pearly Everlasting from Test Plot, which is over in Hamlin Midway. And this is an example of a host plant. So this is where a caterpillar of a particular butterfly only eats Pearly Everlasting, and this is kind of what it looks like. So if you see that in your garden, don't worry, it just means that you're supporting some little caterpillars. The samples were analyzed for heavy metals at the University of Minnesota Soil Analytical Lab. I sprung for the more expensive sampling, which covers 27 different elements, which includes heavy metals as well as like calcium and potassium and things like that. So that 27 different metals and elements is quite a lot. So for this presentation and to understand my results, I just focused on water-soluble metals, metals that are commonly found in roadsides in Minnesota. So we have a sense of like what the baseline might be. And then metals that also impact humans who might be gardening or digging in the soil. So overall findings, I'll dive into our specific findings in more detail, but in general, almost all the samples, except a few, had relatively low levels of heavy metals. I did meet with some University of Minnesota researchers who look at a lot of heavy metal data, and they were like, they made a comment of like, the metals in your samples are pretty low compared to what they have seen, so that was good. There was only a few that were elevated and known at levels that were known to be harmful to caterpillars. For soils, again, almost all of them except a few had relatively low levels of heavy metals, or levels that, matched background concentrations. Except there was a few samples with elevated lead and arsenic, which I will talk a little bit more about. And then sort of expected, but the samples near the foundry had pretty astronomical levels of all the different heavy metals. So that was kind of something that was expected, but a main finding. So in South Como, this is the map of South Como, and just wanted to show you where I sampled last summer in our neighborhood. So I sampled in two places at Como Park, just thinking about like wanting a more like control or like a place that's more of a green space, maybe not near busy roads, things like that. So I sampled in this little like oak patch here, and then around the side of Como Lake where there's cut plant and goldenrod. I also sampled near the railroad at the Orchard Rec Center, thinking about, some of the feedback I had last year from you all in this meeting where folks were concerned about the railroad and were there heavy metals coming from the railroad. So I took a couple samples there and thinking about where kids are playing. So thinking about kids might be playing in the park as well. I took samples at the garden that's in front of the Orchard Rec Center. And then I also took samples at what we call Jamco Garden, or the garden that's on Jameson Front. I took samples both inside the garden itself, and then because there's oak trees along the side, and I was sampling oak trees across the neighborhoods, I also sampled the margin here as well. So first, I'm going to talk about the soil lead data. I'm going to walk through this graph slowly. So the y-axis is soil lead values in parts per million. And then the x-axis here is just all the different locations that I sampled. The words are really small. You don't have to worry about what the words are, but the ones that are in red are the ones that are from our neighborhood. If you're not familiar with box and whisker plots, I really like them a lot because they really tell a story of what's happening in your data. So, for example, if one of these white boxes is really wide, it means that the variation in the different samples from that same place is very wide, is big. So some samples had really low soil lead and some samples had really high soil lead. So the range is just really high. Whereas, boxes that are really flat and squished, it means that there was more consistency. So in the samples that I took at that location, they were all relatively similar. And I took slightly different numbers of samples at each of these locations, but it still gives, a general picture of, the spotty concentrations in different places. And then the dots are the soil underneath a particular plant species. So if you see this sort of brownish dot, that means that I was sampling, that soil sample came from underneath the cup plant. So I just plotted the actual data onto this graph too, just to give us a little bit more sense of what's going on. So this is the same graph as before, but I overlaid onto it the EPA and the MPCA soil lead hazard levels. So the EPA is 200 parts per million in soil for human safety, and the Minnesota soil lead hazard is 100 parts per million. And this is for soil that's like, I forget the exact phrasing, but it's like open soil in like public places that where it's bare. So that's where they don't really want people interacting with it if it's above those levels. For our neighborhood, soil lead was below that threshold. Keeping in mind, this threshold changes. So the threshold is decided by scientists who then tell regulators who are appointed by politicians who decide what these levels are. And so they change over time. So it didn't used to be 200 parts per million, it used to be 400. And then a couple of years ago, through advocacy and science and really pressuring and making sure that people were safe from soil lead, it came out that it's actually 200. And I imagine we're going to see a lot of these change in our lifetimes. So just keeping that in mind. But one of the samples from the Jameson front garden was about 77 parts per million lead. So it's getting up there. But because we know that this is a former Superfund site, we've been wearing gloves and really communicating about the potential risks of working in this garden. And so a note, we should just continue to do what we're doing and wear gloves and make sure you clean your clothes and don't track the dirt from that garden into your house. So just being really careful about, how we make sure we're cleaning our clothes before we come inside. There's University of Minnesota researchers also working at this area in this garden. They're trying to understand how pollinator gardens can help reduce soil contaminants, how they can pull them deeper into the soil so they're not so much at the surface of the soil. So there's a lot of research going on. This is just a small piece of that, but we did find a slightly elevated sample there. This is the same type of graph as before, except it's soil arsenic. And so this has a threshold of 9 parts per million because it's more toxic than lead. And this was sort of curious. Our neighborhood actually had a couple samples that were a little bit above this 9 parts per million threshold. So this is soil arsenic values. This is the area sampled. The areas in the red box are in our neighborhood. And there's the sample from Como Park that was slightly elevated. And then also a sample behind the Orchard Rec field that was also elevated. So when I talked to university researchers about this, the question was, did this used to be an orchard? Because previously arsenic was found in different pesticides that people used to put on the fields. I don't know the history of that, so I'd be curious if anybody here does. But keeping this in mind, this is a place where I would love to take more samples this year. This is like way back near the railroad. I highly doubt that there are children really interacting with the soil here, but it's something to consider. But again, remember this wide box here. So there was a big range. So not every single sample had really, really high arsenic. It was just this one that had slightly elevated. So it just shows that the arsenic levels in these heavy metals can be really patchy. So you might find this area that's really high, but lots of other areas are very low. So I don't want to like scare anybody, but just kind of letting you know that this is something that we might want to look into or think about if we do any kind of work back near the railroad of that area. So that's, yeah, that's what this sample looks like. You can see this is the railroad back here, and the soil is like underneath this sort of patch of vegetation. Overall, the leaves from our neighborhood had really low levels of heavy metals, which is good. But again, there isn't extensive data on how it might impact survival of other species or how other insects use plants. So this is a picture of prairie sage at the Orchard Rec Garden that's right in front of the building. And you can see that one of these leaves looks a little of a different color. So that actually is a type of bee that will sort of shave the fuzz off of plants like prairie sage to build their nests. So, insects are interacting with these plant materials in all different types of ways, and in ways that we don't know if contaminants are in there if we need to be particularly worried about it. Just really quickly, the soil and oak leaves near the St. Paul Brass Foundry were exponentially higher than any other sample across the study. So to get these sort of ratios, I took the average of every single other sample across the entire study and compared that to the average of samples that I took nearby the brass foundry. So if you've been there before, there's kind of like this road up to Frogtown Farm and Park off of Minnehaha. And then across the road here is this sort of uh, group of oak trees. And so I took samples from the oak leaves, from the soil underneath, and then I took some samples right outside these vents that tend to blow really foul-smelling air. This was a big concern of folks in Frogtown. And yeah, you can see, in some cases it's 140 times higher in copper, lead at levels that we know are harmful to insects and to humans. And so this is something that, I've shared with Frogtown. We are continuing to advocate around the permitting of this foundry. And so feel free to let me know if you have any more questions about that. I also sampled this burdock plant that's kind of also right outside one of these vents, and it also had really high concentrations of heavy metals. Okay, I'm just wrapping up. I have one more slide after this, and I'll turn it over to you for feedback. But I just wanted to let you know that on May 13th, next Wednesday, there's a free lead soil screening at the Frogtown Community Center. It's from 3 to 7, so you can stop by kind of whenever it works for your schedule and bring a soil sample. On the website, it's through Ramsey County, and so on the website, they'll tell you how to collect a soil sample, or if you have more questions about it, I'm happy to help. You can only bring 3 samples per person. But yeah, if you're curious about soil lead next to your house or in your gardens or where you're planting, your vegetables this year, this would be a great place to bring your samples. I believe they're also doing blood lead level testing as well, and they'll have lots of resources there to, yeah, talk to you about soil lead and soil contaminants. Okay. So now I'm curious about this summer. I'm curious if you have questions about what I just shared. Do you have ideas for sampling this summer? I know we've talked about sampling at the children's garden that was started last year at Orchard Rec Center, and that sort of raised like cement area. And yeah, just if there's other plants of interest, if there's comparisons that you're curious about in other neighborhoods. For example, last year, people were curious about near the road, far away from the road, or little things like that. So We can also do pesticide testing if there's like a particular area that you're concerned about pesticide drift or something like that. Those samples are a little bit more expensive, but we can certainly do that. Um, so yeah, and I do have slides in here that I presented to Hamlin Midway and to Frogtown. So I'm happy to share these slides if you want to like look at them a little bit more closely as well. So I will stop there and curious what you have, questions you have or ideas.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for the presentation, very insightful, and thanks for the work. One, going back to your question about what Orchard Rec used to be, I believe it was a cemetery, so I don't know if that would potentially play any role in that.
Hmm.
But I was wondering, if anybody else on the board felt that would be interesting to get soil samples from either the community garden or from the Churchill garden that we have volunteers digging in all the time. It would be nice to know what they're digging through.
Yeah, and we have gotten soil samples on our community garden that's like potted and people grow vegetables in. I we did like a free program through the county. I doubt it was the expensive soil sample, but we have sampled that in the last year. But yeah, we do have volunteers in the church garden across the street from the streetcar station pretty regularly. I was curious, as somebody who lives 2 blocks from the boundary, is there a radius you've been able to identify of like where? Like, is it just like a straight line drop off, or is it like within X feet of the boundary? It's hundreds of times worse, or like the Frogtown Farm is right there. Is it drop off by the time you get to their field, or?
Yeah, it's a great question and something that, Frogtown Neighborhood Association and folks have been like trying to figure out because air is so complicated in the way it moves and the way it might blow and deposit in like kind of unexpected ways. I didn't show this data, but last year I worked with some interns with the Frogtown Neighborhood Association who were really interested in soil lead. And so we did sort of walk around near the foundry, kind of around the outside of it in the neighborhood and took soil samples. And, as you get closer to the foundry, the soil gets much higher. We didn't find like above 100 parts per million lead anywhere except right near those vents. I know that folks have worked with Frogtown Farm and Park before and have done like hundreds of samples in the area where they grow, and they didn't like find anything that was like astronomically higher. But what I found when I talked to people who do that, when we found these samples from the foundry, we alerted the Minnesota Department of Health, we alerted the MPCA, we alerted the county, we are in contact with our city council members. Like, hey, we found elevated lead, it's above the standard, what do we do? And nobody has any responsibility to fix it. So I wish I could like be like, oh, well, if you find elevated lead, you can just talk to somebody who will help you fix it. But unfortunately, you might end up getting the runaround. That's a little bit of a tangent, but I haven't done like a detailed study of the radius around the foundry, but it's a good question. And yeah, I know the MPCA does have a dashboard or like a way you can submit like smell complaints. So if you are smelling the foundry, you can go online and do that. I don't know what they do with that information, but it helps to have it logged. So yeah, doesn't really answer your question, but we've tried.
Yeah, it seems farther because there's these railroad tracks, but like South Como is not far from the boundary as the crow flies. Like we have Stinson Park down in South Como there, and that's a quarter mile from the boundary.
Mm-hmm.
So Stinson Park might be a place to test if it's not already dot on the map.
Mm-hmm.
I think when you're asking about specifically pesticide testing, we've got a big golf course right in the middle of the neighborhood. And I know that every once in a while we'll sort of hear folks asking, what do they use at the golf course? Is, their application schedule tied to like wind direction or anything like that. So I think that's a place where we certainly have a lot of residential areas that butt up right against the golf course. I think Chelsea Heights is the block or two, right? The elementary school is a block or two from the golf course there. Like that would probably, you'd find an interested audience for that question.
Yeah, I always wonder every time I walk by there, like, are they spraying in there?
Yeah, and likewise, I don't know how cemetery lawns are maintained and all of that, but we have two adjacent in the neighborhood. And I know Calvary has their like maintenance facilities right across the street from Jamco, so I would suspect that they're doing heavy metal operations there, probably some sort of pesticide or herbicide.
Yeah, I've seen them out spraying, yeah, quite a bit. Yeah.
Well, are there any other questions or comments for Julia here? All right, well, we're not hearing any, so again, thank you for the presentation and the work and all the information. I thought it was insightful. I didn't know that. I didn't know something like, I thought that I was expecting something to be higher, to be honest. So good to know that it's low in most places.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. It was great. If you have I know sometimes for me, I like need to percolate before I have a question. So I'll put my email in the chat. You're welcome to reach out to me whenever. I live right near Front and Hatch, so I'm nearby. If you see me out and about, you can talk about it if you have other ideas. So yeah, thanks all. This is great.